So I know there will be a couple of extra folks that will roll in. So Caitlin, if you want to go ahead and just kick us off, they'll join in as they can.
Sure. I'm going to go off camera just to not try and take up too much bandwidth with my presenting my screen, but we can go ahead and get going. So I'll just start by just giving a quick welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining the call. Thank you for participating in the steering committee to help guide our area-wide planning projects for the Statesville Brownfields Assessment Grant. I saw most of the names on the invite. I think we've already engaged in for the most part, so you all should be familiar with the project, but we'll just do a quick overview just in case as a refresher. And I think we can start with doing some introductions. Why is this not advancing? There we go. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
All good.
Okay. So just a quick agenda actually first for the meeting. We'll start with some welcome and introductions. We're going to give you just a quick project overview and update on where we are with the project schedule. A brief explanation of the steering committee roles and responsibilities and your importance in the project. We'll go over what we've seen so far from our existing conditions analysis. We have our market study team on the phone as well. They'll go over their findings of the market study. We'll talk a little bit about what we heard from community engagement, and then we're going to bring up a mural mapping exercise, which is basically similar to the mapping exercise that we did in our first community engagement event. But we wanted to give the steering committee a chance to look at the maps with us again and start to identify some of those opportunities and constraints as we move into the actual design phase of the project. So this is kind of our last chance to look at the map together and talk before we actually start putting our pens to paper and coming up with our recommendations and strategies and design alternatives and so on. Then we'll just have some Q&A discussion and talk a little bit about what the next step is after this process. So let's do some introductions and we can start with our team. I'll just go first. I am Caitlin Woolard. I am on our Brownfields community revitalization team, and I am a landscape architect and planner by trade, and I am managing the projects, the area-wide planning projects that we are here to talk about today under our Brownfields grant. And Brian, would you like to go next?
Sure. Oh, sorry. Good afternoon, everybody. Brian Quam, and I'm the overall program project manager for the grant for the city, leading the technical aspects and the overall project. So from a programmatic support, any questions related to not the planning parts? I'm a geologist by trade. I do technical assessment and remediation on projects. So I leave the planning parts to these guys, and they do a great job for us. We really appreciate them. So any other questions unrelated to the planning aspects, I can help answer. That's my role.
Jason, you want to go next?
I'll go next. Yep. Hey, everyone. Jason Betsky. I'm a planner and urban designer, and I'm overseeing kind of the land use and the framework analysis for the two study areas, and brought back some great learning from our first workshop. So that was exciting. Great to meet everybody there. So we look forward to getting the next portion of this moving. So thanks for having us. Oh, and I want to remind everyone, I'm going to be off camera and I'm going to be in transit. So just so everybody knows, but I'll be focused on what we're talking about. But I'll be around here for this beginning of the presentation. Just a heads up.
Andrew?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Andrew McCray, urban planner with Stantec. Happy to be on a call this afternoon, and look forward to engaging with you all and just learning more about Statesville and trying to put the best project for you all. So good afternoon. Happy to be.
I don't believe we have Joe on the call. Joe Polachek is another urban planner with our team, and then we also have Tom Layton from our team on as well. Tom, are you there?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll represent myself and Spencer Cox. We are, I'm a urban planner and an economic development specialist, and we on this project are paying attention to the market context for development, and we bring that expertise to projects all around the country where we work with communities to help them understand what's your real world opportunity for attracting new development in different focus areas. So that's our role in this project. Happy to be here. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Tom. And Spencer's not on the call, correct?
Right, that's right.
Okay. All right. So I'll just go through briefly, kind of how we got here. As Brian had said, he's the manager for our EPA Brownfields assessment grant that the city of Statesville currently holds. The Brownfields program allows entities to assist with environmental assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment planning within their communities under the Brownfield grant funding. EPA really sees this money as the seed money for redevelopment and revitalization of the areas that are identified to spend the money on. Redevelopment is really the ultimate goal of the program. So because of that, Statesville identified 2 study areas in which they wanted to take a deeper look at, understanding to outline basically all the sites that they need to do assessment work on, and then the areas that need the most, need the strategies for revitalization themselves. Those study areas, as you all are familiar, is the West Front Street corridor and the Monroe Street corridor. So we have begun an area-wide planning project to address the needs of both of those areas of the city. I basically just went over that. So here is just the map that we had from our community engagement event showing where those corridors are. And I like this map because it kind of shows where they are in relationship to each other and to the greater city of Statesville. So these are our focus areas for the projects. And the goal is to understand the needs, hear the community, assess the market conditions and the existing conditions of the areas themselves of each individual area. And then come up with revitalization strategies to address those needs. The project schedule, this is the project schedule that we had presented at the initial kickoff meeting with the city. It is probably going to move a little bit from here, but you can see we're well underway. We had our kickoff meeting back in December. We've been doing our existing conditions assessment and analysis. Through December and January, we had our first community engagement meeting, the visioning workshop, the last week of January, right on schedule. And since then, we have still been kind of working through that existing conditions analysis, digesting everything that we've heard in the community engagement meeting. And we've also been continuing to conduct stakeholder interviews. I think we initially said that we were going to do, 4 to 6 stakeholder interviews. I think we've done 8 to 10. Because we've just identified more and more people to engage in the project, and more people were willing to engage in the project, which is fantastic. So we are moving now we're at the end of February, and we're moving towards that next workshop. That's going to be a development alternatives workshop for both corridors. We can do them again as a joint meeting, or we can do them maybe on back-to-back nights. That's something that we'll have to work with the city to determine the best way to go about those, but that will be the next engagement opportunity. We have, I think I have it outlined on here, the steering committee meetings, but you all have been identified by the city as the steering committee for the project. We'll have 3 steering committee meetings throughout this process. The first one obviously is today. The next one, I think it would probably make the most sense that we hold that next one before we bring our development alternatives to the community, just to get your feedback at that point, and then we can go into that next community meeting. And then the third steering committee meeting will be towards the end of the project when we are ready to present our draft area-wide plan to the public as well. So again, I think right now our second workshop is scheduled for the beginning of March, second week in March. We'll probably push that back a little bit, but we have that flexibility to do so in this schedule.
All right.
And now, Yep, go ahead,
I'll
Jason.
pick up from here. Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, just real quick before we dive into what really encapsulates our initial analysis of the site. But it's really about the steering committee role and what we're hoping that you can bring to the table as we go through the process. And you can see it pretty clearly here, but it's really about interacting with, serving as those liaisons, either to your neighborhood that you live in, or maybe it's a row of businesses that you are close to or represent, or any community groups that you may belong to. We just ask that you get the word out there and let people know this is happening. And if you hear things, let us know and kind of be that conduit to the community. We expect you to provide input throughout, and including, you're there living it every day. We would love to hear from you. What contextual elements should we know about as we're doing planning for these areas? And what are your aspirations for these study areas? We want to hear that throughout the process. And then finally, as we start to put recommendations on the table, we really want to get your confirmation that we're all buying into what direction this is moving in. And we absolutely look at your recommendations as part of informing what those what our planning proposal comes up to. So really simple, just stay engaged with us. Let us know if you hear anything, get the word out there, and let us know if we're moving in the right direction when the time comes. Next. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we're going to go through existing conditions for both of the study areas. We can go through this pretty quick. We've all been there. We know the area well, but there's some opportunities that start to kind of arise from what we do see. But Front Street, and this goes for Monroe as well, but really auto-oriented, a lot of surface parking. One thing we were asked to look at is, how can these different corridors serve as gateways into the community, and to, what a great downtown you have, and, be very welcoming and inviting to people. So we see things such as parking lots and no trees, and, buildings that may be vacant. The railway on Front Street obviously plays a big role in, with the industrial development, and then how that kind of bifurcates the study area a little bit to the east. People aren't able to walk very much in the area. They can do it. We know people walk along the tracks to access certain amenities, but there's not really an intuitive, sidewalk trail network that really is giving people a safe and comfortable walking environment. And then finally, the existing road network, it really balances the automobile and truck traffic, and why shouldn't it? That's what this area grew up around. But as we think about, becoming a gateway and getting people to downtown, these are some of the elements that are how you extend that downtown and create the gateways, creating something that's walkable and inviting, that maybe balances automobile traffic with pedestrian traffic, things like that. So next slide, please. All right, and in Monroe Street, a lot of similarities. What's interesting, and we'll go through some maps here real quick in a bit, but Monroe Street, you go north of the street, very industrial, go south of it, you're in the residential neighborhoods. So speaking of bifurcation, this area really is a challenging area to look at for planning, but we've heard a few things of how we could potentially turn what has been traditionally industrial, predominantly industrial, into a place that might be a bit more inviting and in line with what the vision for the future of Statesville is. We know that the commercial businesses are predominantly south of Monroe as it goes through, sparse, but they are there. Limited connectivity. We know the Monroe area is going to be undergoing, the highway there is going to be undergoing some changes. And if I remember correctly, there are going to be some intersection changes which create more connectivity. But people really want the ability to move. They didn't feel comfortable, from what we heard, moving from the neighborhoods into that area. It's safe. So there's some opportunities to connect people throughout, and all the way to downtown for that matter. And then we all know this, all the vacant and underutilized parcels in the area. There's some gems in the area, like Purple Heart Homes, that are really starting to do some great things around the region. But it's mostly industrial with residential adjacent to it. So is there an opportunity to think about what services might be missing, and how do we incorporate that as the future goes? Next slide. Okay, so let's start with Monroe, and this is just going to be a quick walk through the, the mapping. And when we get to the end at our exercise here, we'll pull up the maps and ask you specifically if you're at the open house, which I think most of you may have been. You'll have seen that we had the maps out and we had Post-its all over it, and we were gathering input. And actually, it was a great opportunity to speak to people around the area. So the exercise at the end will ask you that again and help us understand the area a bit more. But again, it's auto-oriented, industrial. You can see all the parcels for the single family homes, the large parcels for the industrial. So it's a tricky area, but we say that there's some good, I guess, bones in place to build on. Next slide. We look at land use analysis. Ultimately, when the city takes our recommendations, this will work its way into, and I don't want to answer for them, but typically we will make land use recommendations, and it would make its way into a comprehensive plan or a master plan to then at a policy level guide future development. So this is where the input that we're receiving from the community and from yourselves on the steering committee starts to have an impact on, this is where the rubber hits the road as far as recommending what land uses go where, and ultimately how that then flows into and weaves itself into the regulatory environment and the zoning ordinance for when people do come to develop here. This snapshot here again tells me very much residential south, that moves into a little bit of commercial and mostly industrial. So it's this really, you'll have pod-like development for your land uses, and you want to do that with industrial to a degree. But when it comes to commercial services and residential, we might think about how do we kind of mix and allow people better access through having these services closer to one another. Next slide. We look at the environment, super important. We want to understand what the tree cover is. Where are the streams? What are the sensitive environmental areas that we need to be careful of, or that we can draw upon and create maybe additional open spaces or leisure opportunities. So we want to understand the impacts of stormwater. Obviously, we're looking at the pollutants and, with the Brownfields piece. And we understand to a good degree what structures are here and which may not be here in the short term. Next slide. We look at public space analysis. Public spaces, think of parks, plazas, trails, those places where you can go to relax or recreate. And that's an important piece of planning and giving people opportunity to experience nature close by. A good rule of thumb, if you can be within 1/8 of a mile, no more than 1/4 mile from some type of a park or open space, health benefits go up immensely for those citizens or residents that live close to that. Not to mention the social aspect and being able to meet with people. And that's one thing I'll say I was at the map for Monroe Street, and the residents that came up, they're longing for a place that they go sit and have a cup of coffee and just talk to your neighbors. They wanted a place like that in this area. So when we do our planning, we think about how can we weave together. You can look around the perimeter of the study area and you see these open spaces and public spaces. So how can you bring people to those, or what can you put inside the study area that would complement the surrounding public spaces? Next slide. Mobility, we look at transportation all the way from roads to sidewalks to transit if it's part of the puzzle. What we've identified here is that there are a lot of proposed sidewalks. We noticed a lot of missing gaps throughout the study area, a few proposed bike lanes. So this is a great snapshot of showing how the city or the town is starting to work toward connecting people and to the remainder of the city. And I say ultimately the downtown is kind of the sweet spot that you want to be able to get people to. Next slide. All right, this is just showing, some of the images we saw, what kind of has driven what I was just talking about. You can see purple hearts on the bottom left, a big vacant area, but lots of opportunity. We see a lot of opportunity in the area. And I'm going to leave it at that for now, but if you want to go to the next slide, we can talk to Front Street. We talked about Front Street a little bit, but again, our study area, you can see what area it encompasses in red. A lot of strip development up into the industrial development, and then all the way to the eastern side where it starts to become more residential, and then to the south, obviously of Front Street, a lot more residential. So as someone traverses from the west side to the east side of the study area, it's a big, there's a lot of differences, and the way it kind of brings people into the community. So that's what we're looking at. If you're arriving here in a gateway, as a gateway, what is that experience like? At the same time, we also want to think about how are we balancing the economics of this, and does it make sense to have as much commercial development? Tom will speak to some of that, but we're wanting to balance the types of uses in both study areas, residential versus commercial versus industrial, as we go forward. Next slide. Land uses, again, I don't need to spend a lot of time on these, but you can see that darker color, the industrial, right along the railroad tracks, all the way up to, Front Street there is the commercial. So, and then you have the pot of residential to the south and then to the southeast. And how do we start to weave those areas together and allow people access throughout the area? Next slide. Environmental, there's not much green in this one, I will say. And that tells us, a lot in a quick snapshot. So, where are the opportunities to add some trees perhaps, or maybe there's a public open space that starts to bring some of the nature into the area. It's kind of about, I mentioned balancing the automobiles versus the pedestrians. This is kind of balancing, the city versus nature, but bringing in those natural elements that help, in so many different areas. And again, obviously it's looking at the brownfields and the contaminants. Next slide. Public space analysis, you can see we do have some public spaces in here, but we want to know how they're used and how could they be used differently? What programs or what design changes could be made to make them a better contributor? The religious institutions, which we call out here, the reason we do that is because there is access oftentimes to programs or recreation on these sites, but that's not going to do everything the community needs. So we want to take a bigger look at the public space again. Next slide. Mobility analysis. This area is a little messy, obviously with the railroad tracks, but you can see if you read the lines closely, there are either proposed sidewalks or trails that traverse a good section of the study area. It's just we got to make sure we're tying it to the larger network and that it makes sense at the end of the day. Next slide. And then just a couple shots. We all know what this area looks like. I see a lot of opportunities in these pictures. Hopefully you can do the same by the time we're done with this process. I think, Caitlin, we can leave it at that probably for the existing. I believe that's the last slide.
Yep.
All right.
And we will turn it over to.
Perfect.
When it gets mad when I go to Teams. There we go. Over to Tom for the market analysis summary.
Thank you.
Thanks, and I will go ahead and turn off my camera. So nice summary, Jason, of existing conditions. And I want to say at the outset, I'm kind of aware. Well, I want to express appreciation to you all who are on the steering committee, and congratulations for being a first meeting. And I know that I'm going to talk through now observations we've made relative to the market context and economic conditions. So, and that's our job, to come back to you and tell you what we've learned so far about Statesville, both existing conditions and market conditions. But I know it's a meeting then that starts out with a lot of listening on your end. So I want to acknowledge that, but also say, as you listen to this is sort of our report back to you, our initial report back to you. And we have been working hard, and that's our job, to understand your local context, but you also are experts at that. So as you're listening, just really invite you to think about, okay, I agree with that, or that raises questions in my mind, or you're missing something that I think is important to put in this conversation. So those are things you can be thinking about as we reflect back to what we've learned. Now, so my job with one of my close coworkers, Spencer Cox, has been to understand the economic environment in Statesville and drilling down to economic and market conditions for these specific areas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about overall what's driving the economy in Statesville as a whole, and then we'll drill down to how that leads to some takeaways for the areas that we're focused on here. So next slide, Caitlin. This is a chart of population growth in Iredell County as a whole. So way back to 2000, there has been consistent growth in Iredell County. Next slide. But when we look at Statesville specifically, now this is a chart of household, number of households, we see that starting in 2010, there was a kind of a big decline in households, and that says to me that maybe you lost a lot of homes in the foreclosure crisis that might have hit Statesville pretty hard. But you can see that turned around in the middle of the decade, and actually there are more households in Statesville now than there were at the beginning of that the Great Recession. Next slide. So you're on a growth trajectory at this point in time. This is a snapshot, and I know the industrial categories at the bottom of this chart are kind of small, but in each of those categories, the one on the left, for example, is healthcare. For each of these categories, it compares the Statesville percentage of jobs in that category with the percentage of jobs in the greater Charlotte area. So there's a point of reference for you. And so of the top 4 categories, the biggest 4 blue bars, 3 of those really relate to Statesville serving as sort of a regional center for the areas around Statesville. Those are healthcare, educational services, and retail. But one of them is manufacturing, is unrelated to that and is really a driver probably of the economic prosperity coming out of the region, and is unique to this environment and not related to being a regional center. It's a driver of indirect business, services, and spending in the local economy. Next slide. And you can see here in this chart, the large bubble looks at folks that have jobs in Statesville, but live outside of Statesville, 21,000 people. And then if you compare the number on the right, those who live in Statesville and work outside of Statesville are only 8,000 people. So it's a big job destination, Statesville is. Next slide. This slide just looks strictly at industrial development in the last 10 years as a way of thinking about the economic growth in Statesville. And what's striking to me, and this just looks at industrial development over the last 10 years, there's 2 things that are really striking about this chart. One is the size of the industrial facilities that are being built in Statesville. And the second is, if you look at the dates when they were constructed, 75% of them have been constructed in the next few years or are under construction. So you've got this boom in manufacturing space, distribution space, and in talking to folks that are in that industrial development business, what they are saying is there's a threshold that was crossed where industrial properties that are closer to the larger metropolitan areas have that convenience space has been used up in some areas, and industrial developers, manufacturers have discovered that Statesville is really convenient to the region. So that's a trend that is likely to continue and likely to result in additional job growth. Next slide, please. So this is a chart that compares the income trajectory in Statesville to that of North Carolina as a whole, Iredell County as a whole, and some of the cities that you might compare yourself to. And Statesville tends to be a lower income households, but you can see that in recent years that there's an upward trajectory in median incomes to the point where starting to achieve a median income that's close to some of your comparison cities, and that's a result of this employment growth and the job growth. Next slide, please. So also we know that income isn't equally distributed around a region. I don't have our study areas outlined on this map specifically. You may be able to know what they are yourself, but generally it's in some of the lower income parts of Statesville. Next slide, please. Just a couple other demographic characteristics. Statesville is a very diverse region. 50% white non-Latino population, so quite diverse. Next slide, please. This is important for understanding housing needs because this is a chart that shows the percentage of your renter households and the percentage of your owner households. The rusty bar and the gray to black bar that are cost burdened. And cost burden means that that household is paying more than 30% of their income on their housing costs. And particularly when a lower income or a moderate income household is paying more than 30% of their income on their housing costs, that starts to leave a really diminishing amount of resources available to address all other life needs. So that's a red flag. Now, the darker part of each of those bars is households that are paying more than 50% of their household income on their housing costs. So that those are considered severely housing cost burdened. And you can see that Statesville has a higher proportion. I mean, housing challenges are common everywhere right now, but Statesville has a higher proportion of cost burden than any of these comparison regions. Next slide, please. So housing is clearly a need, and particularly workforce housing is a high need in the area. So this is a slide that looks at housing unit growth. And so looking at the chart on the left, you can see the decline in housing units, net decline in 2010 and all the way through the middle of the decade, and then net growth in housing units from that point on. And the slide on the right breaks those down in terms of whether they're single family detached, townhome, multifamily. Next slide, please. Here's a chart that, if you look at the blue line on the left, shows the average rents for housing units that are rental units, and you can see the increase in recent years in rents, and the chart on the right shows the home values, median home values. And again, similar thing is happening on the right side of the chart in the last couple of years in terms of home prices that are increasing. That can have some benefits for existing homeowners, but it can be a challenge for someone who are entering the market. And rents increases can certainly be a challenge for existing renter households. Those are also signals that those also signal to developers that they may be able to build more housing. It's a signal of demand for housing when rents increase like that. Next slide, please. So this is a chart that shows, similar to the industrial chart, that there are starting to be new multifamily housing developments that are coming online in Statesville. And you can see that they tend to be larger developments. A couple of these are proposed. One of the proposed developments has almost 500 units. So a couple of them are proposed, and they tend to be recent developments again. So that is a market threshold where new multifamily housing is starting to occur here. It's starting to occur in suburban locations. Hasn't happened yet in Statesville, but that doesn't mean that as these are successful, that demand, you might be approaching a demand for multifamily housing in more core locations as well. Next slide, please. And one chart on retail as well. Retail, in a sense, is not going to be a driver of development. It follows the increase in population, and the increase in population follows workforce demand. So there's a ripple effect there. Retail is a lagging indicator, retail growth, as opposed to a leading indicator. But again, you can see where new retail development is occurring is in certain parts of the city and less commonly in the core. Next slide, please. So those are the little windows into the market analysis that I wanted to show for this presentation. We have a lot more data and illustrations that we can share with you and that are available. But I wanted to summarize. Okay, so and we also talked to a couple of individuals in the development community. how are we applying that to our study areas? And certainly the first bullet point here is that the residential and industrial developments are the most, have the most demand currently, and other development will follow that demand. For industrial development, these areas from a location sense are desirable locations. They don't compete with industrial locations at the perimeter of the city currently, simply because at the perimeter of the city, development is simple. You've got raw land, you can build a manufacturing facility, you can build a distribution facility. To attract development, industrial development to these locations is likely to require support for both site assembly, to package a site that is of interest to industrial developers in some cases, and then the type of site preparation, cleanup, demo that puts that site on equal footing to the development locations at the perimeter of Statesville. Residential development, there's growing demand for residential development, and you can see with the growing economy that is likely to continue. In this corridor, you're not likely to see a proposal for luxury apartments like we're seeing in the perimeter because of the area context, but there are housing types that would certainly meet needs in Statesville that could be fostered in this area. More workforce housing that is affordable to the workforce, infill housing that's smaller formats. I think there'd be a lot of opportunities for that here. Again, those are likely to need public financial support, both in remediating the site and potentially for to meet a development financing gap. Big picture observation about the existing context, and this was alluded to in that there is that in its current condition, it's not a highly attractive location for housing development to come in. And one of the ways we think about that for redevelopment is intentionally taking steps to build that context. If there's streetscaping that can be installed, if there are pocket parks, if there's, you know, a site infill site redevelopment that can be attractive. So as you take those steps along the way, you're patiently building a more attractive market context, and you're lowering the hurdle for attracting new development. And the last thing I wanted to say is that in the really big picture, you are at a time in your history where you are having renewed interest, external interest in development for the right reasons. And there are mechanisms for capturing some of that new developer interest and leveraging that to support reinvestment in the core. And you might, as we think about, you know, this project and we think about implementation mechanisms, you might sort of bear that in mind. What are some of those mechanisms where we might leverage new you know, real estate tax revenues and other prosperity that's happening in Statesville and utilize that in some of these areas, in these core areas. I'm done.
Sorry, I forgot to bring myself off mute. Thank you, Tom.
So looking for feedback on that, as I'm sure Jason and Caitlin are as well.
All right, and then I will just give a overview of the community engagement process, where we're at in it, and the feedback that we have been hearing so far. I will say that we're hearing a lot of things from the community that have just reinforced what we're seeing, that have reinforced what we've already talked to staff about. You know, the needs that were very obvious. We heard a lot of comments of kind of backing up what those things were that people wanted to see. So we started, basically, we're well underway into our community engagement process. January 30th was when we had our visioning workshop. We had 55 people sign in to that meeting, which is fantastic turnout, especially for Brownfield grant projects that we've had a history with. But even the city was very, very happy with the turnout there. Lots of engagement, lots of people putting sticky notes down, lots of people showing up for the donuts. But it was a really good turnout, a really successful meeting, and we're happy with that. And that makes us really optimistic for the next workshop that we'll be having in the next month or so. That same day, we also did a staff tour of the study areas, and we had code enforcement with us, which I also thought was fantastic, because they were able to give us their perspective on the needs of the communities for the respective areas that the code enforcement officers were over. And then since, like I said, when we were talking about the schedule from beginning of January to now, I think I even had a stakeholder interview last week. I think we've done 10. I wrote 8 on there, but I think we've done 10 stakeholder interviews, and that's just done a fantastic job helping us lay a solid foundation of engagement for this project and to really get the ball rolling. Again, we're gonna open it up for discussion on this call because we want to hear from the steering committee as well, especially since you'll be guiding this project. We want to make sure that we hear everything that you have to say to inform the plan as well. Especially from the visioning workshop that we had, we heard mainly that the attendees supported having more community amenities, more parks, more greenways, more gathering spaces. A lot of the comments I feel like we heard was there's just needs to be more for people to do. People live over there, people work over there, but there's just not enough for people to do. And that type of, activity centers is really what is necessary to support the communities and the people who are working and living in that area. Overall beautification, obviously that was one of the biggest things that we had talked to the city about when we first started this project, was just making this a more beautiful corridor, including some signage and gateway parks, just place-making elements of typical streetscape projects. But that was reinforced at the community meeting. That was something that everybody, we had a lot of post-it notes on just beautification, cleaning up different areas for the entire Front Street corridor. Connectivity and pedestrian safety was huge. Big need for improvement. It was reinforced with our existing conditions analysis. I found it very striking, the lack of crosswalks or the condition of the sidewalks that they were in, even if they did exist. And then hearing from the community about, people making cut-throughs, walking down rail corridors, riding their bikes, across the middle of intersections of a 5-way intersection. It's very evident that connectivity, pedestrian safety were needs for improvements, especially with the intersection improvements. For a corridor like that, especially with the heavy industrial use, it was very evident from talking to the community that the intersections really needed to be prioritized or redesigned to prioritize the pedestrians. So that's a huge need. Safety, loitering. There's some concern with homelessness and vandalism in the corridor. So that's going to be definitely something that we'll consider in our design recommendations of how do we not only make it a more beautiful place, but how do we make it a more safe place, and how do you protect the investments that you make in that place? How are new amenities managed? Those are things we'll consider as we work through our recommendations. Here's the corridor map that we had there. Again, you can kind of read some of these. A lot of people asking for beautification, crosswalks. I see right down the center. Housing, people ask for retail. Restaurants, I heard that a lot. A gas station. I had someone tell me a story about how they were doing something in this corridor and they had to get to a gas station and they were almost out of gas and they were praying that they weren't going to run out because they had to drive, another mile or so out of the study area to get gas. So that was something that someone thought was a very dire need. I also want to bring up, I don't think I have, I don't have the bucket exercise outlined on here, but I'll let you know that, these are all the things that people told us they wanted, but then we also had our exercise of, if you had the money, if this was your investment, where would you spend the money on the Front Street corridor? And the results of that were 28 votes for retail and restaurants, 22 votes for housing and housing diversity, 19 votes for parks and open space, 14 votes for sidewalks and bike lanes. And then we had tying for first place was actually 28 votes for other. And those other votes included A youth center, beautification, safety improvements, kind of a lot of the things that were reinforced with the Post-it notes on the plan itself. Traffic calming. I had a couple votes for better drainage and infrastructure, which I thought was an interesting comment. Transit, and that was another thing too, reinforced by our existing conditions analysis on the mobility side, is that public transit is a big issue as well. You know, this is a main corridor to downtown and into the city. There's a lot of residential in the area, but there's only one bus line, I think, that comes kind of close to touching the study area, and no bus stop. So people who live over here and have limited means of transportation can't really get anywhere safely if they were to try and have an alternative mode of transportation to get to that workplace. So that's something we heard a lot, and people are concerned that there's not alternate methods of transportation in these areas. Yeah, crosswalks, connectivity, and so on. So again, the other votes reinforced a lot of things that we wanted to hear, but or we had heard already. But yeah, again, number one for Front Street, people wanted to spend their money on retail and restaurant. All right, and then Monroe Street corridor. The attendees wanted to see more, again, I mean, they're kind of similar in wanting to have amenities, places for the youth, places for people to congregate, a community center, a small community gathering space. I remember I spoke to one person about them really wanting to have something for kids and performing arts in that area. So amenities to serve the community, young and old, just giving people things to do in that area. Same problems as the other corridors: safety, walking, biking, connectivity to the greater communities around them. I know that there's a lot of issues getting across Gardner Bangle Boulevard, Highway 70 here. And I know that there are some plans in place with the future Greenway connections to help solve those problems, but really just playing off of those and making sure that we can provide people in these areas with better connectivity to the areas outside of the study area. More housing options. People want to continue to see housing developing in this area, and housing diversity, and businesses closer to neighborhoods within walking distance. And I think that also plays into the fact that in this study area, I heard someone tell me that, you know, they don't have anywhere close by to buy their groceries, or to get gas, or to go to, I think there's a couple dollar stores, but there weren't enough retail opportunities. So having more things that people can walk to, just neighborhood scale living where people can walk to get the things that they need, or at least have a short drive, or a safe way to ride a bike there. And then just area being cleaned up. Same as Front Street corridor, people just want some beautification. Another thing I'll also add that's not on here is we heard a lot about site lighting, and I think that just plays off of the concerns for safety. The Front Street corridor, here is the map. You can see restaurant, housing, youth center, performing arts center, clean it up. Community garden, fish farm. We heard that actually on both areas. So, I mean, again, it just kind of goes to that amenities. What are the things that people can do? What can people take part in these areas?
And Caitlin,
Yes.
I'm going to add one thing. I was just reminded that it access to fresh food, and just, you know, being able to get meals by either walking or taking a bike, you know, just really local access. And I think that was you know, whether you have a fish farm or whatever, I think it illustrates a point of kind of what's one of the things that's lacking, or what people desired.
Mm-hmm. And actually, you can see that in the Post-it on the bottom right: grocery store, fresh food. Just better access and better ability to get to those types of amenities for the neighborhoods. On the bucket exercise, again, what would the public invest their own money into if they could invest money into this area? The number one response for this one was housing. I think that really plays off of the fact that housing is organically happening over here already. People want housing. It's adjacent to a lot of heavy residential areas, and people want to see more housing and diversity of housing. So even though we've talked about, you know, some issues with the compatibility of land use, I think it's definitely something we'll consider of how do we how do we encourage housing? How do we foster housing? And how do we work with what the industrial land uses that we have to work with? The second most voted for bucket was retail restaurants. Again, amenities, places for people to go, places for people to eat, and retail and shopping opportunities. The third thing voted for was sidewalks and bike lanes. The fourth was parks and open space. And the last, well, I guess actually with 11 votes, the tied for third place was other. And those other responses reinforced again what we saw on these post-its, having a youth center, an art center, community garden, hydro farm, small business incubator. We had someone vote for that. Improved mobility, transportation, and then clean and beautify the area. Okay, and now we're gonna kind of get into our more